Lawyers of Reddit, what is the dumbest thing your client has done to ruin a case? I was on a jury where the defendant showed up in court day one wearing the exact same outfit as the unknown suspect in the video of the crime. It took only a few seconds before the judge immediately called a stoppage. All lawyers went into the back with the judge, and they came out like 7 minutes later as they announced, the defendant has taken a plea deal. Wild. Story 2. Not my client, but the petitioner attorney's client. The man claimed workers' compensation and threw the kitchen sink at us, meaning he basically listed just over half his body parts on the claim petition stating he injured each one. He was full of crap and my firm knew it. Anyway, we were going to trial, and the day before we ran one more social media search, and this absolute frickin' moron posted a video of him winning a break dance competition that was only a few months after the alleged work incident. Never saw a quicker dismissal in my life. I don't get it. If you're going to fake something like this, commit harder, commit to the bit. It's crazy that you could have done that and just not posted about it and probably have been fine, but you had to go and post it. A breakdance competition? Are you kidding me? Story 3. Not an attorney, but one client of ours baffles me to this day. He had multiple cases, including aggravated battery and drug possession. At the insistence of the dude's family, we moved heaven and earth getting him a bond, so that he could get out of jail and live with said family until the case was over. The whole process took weeks. Less than a day after getting out, he was caught stealing $16 worth of batteries from Target. Bond revoked. To be fair, the line between stupidity and compulsion is blurred with this one. Edit. For anyone curious, we immediately ordered a psych eval for him. He was found competent, but it also confirmed he had mental health issues. The aggravated battery charge ended up being dropped, and he took a plea for time served. Story 4. My wife's lawyer bans all clients from using social media after he lost a big case. Wrongful death lawsuit where a man's wife lost her life. Easy money. They were about to settle until the other side found his pictures online from a club a week after his wife died, getting a lap dance wearing a shirt that said, "I love MILFs." Apparently, they didn't think he had much pain and suffering anymore. Story 5. Not a lawyer. Heard this story from a guy I used to work with. His brother-in-law got injured at work and was suing for a hefty sum. Case was pretty much open and shut. All the evidence was in the brother-in-law's favor until the brother-in-law started talking. They asked him to tell them about the day of the accident. Brother-in-law started out fine until he gets to where he approached the piece of equipment that injured him. He told everyone there was a note on it saying it was out of order. Brother-in-law then says he discarded the note and started up the piece of malfunctioning equipment as he had a job to get done. That easy win was discarded faster than that out of order sign. Story 6. Client added 9 years to a short sentence. He got like a year or two for being involved in a drag race where the other guy crashed and severely injured someone else. Then towards the end of his short prison term, he tried to escape. Got 9 more years for the escape. He became friends with John Lennon's murderer in New York prison, which was interesting. Story 7. The worst ones are the ones who think they're smarter than they are. When it comes time for depositions, broad sweeping statements of how I would never allow discrimination in my office, and how I'm 100% sure I never said that, are a great way to destroy your own credibility. You set yourself up to get eviscerated by opposing counsel, and ultimately turn a nuisance value bullcrap case into something worth 6 figures. Moral of the story. If you're going to ignore the entire day of deposition prep I did with you just so you can protect your own fragile ego on the record, at least do me the courtesy of telling me to screw off ahead of time. Story 8. I had an instructor who was a prosecutor. He called a witness who had seen the whole thing, and had an interest in seeing the defendant punished. Slam dunk case. She thought she was on TV, and she overacted every word. Completely embellished the retelling of the events. Didn't lie, but she was the center of her version of events. You could see the faces of the jury members sour minute on minute. He lost the case. I would be so mad if I were involved in a case where a witness decided to make it all about them and screwed my case over. I'd just be sitting there like, are you kidding me? What could I have done about this? All they had to do was go up and tell the truth. And here we are. Story 9. I was defending a client who was accused of trademark infringement. Thought he knew better than the IP attorney assigned to his case, me, and so went on his company's website to defend himself, basically confessing what he did, and claiming it wasn't against the law, and the trademark owner was a, quote, woke baby, quote, who needed to either learn the law or get back in the kitchen and make her husband a sandwich. Yeah, I wish I could say I was joking. I was one email away from negotiating a settlement that would have allowed the continued use of the complainant's mark with limited restrictions and a very nominal fee. Little to say, she saw his website, told us to go screw ourselves, and dragged it before a judge, and my client lost big. His lack of self-control cost him thousands of dollars. Story 10. Not an attorney, worked in a firm. Workers' compensation claim. Guy falls down at work and claims he injured many different body parts. Shoulder, knees, back. We tell him to stay off social media. Hey, no problem. He doesn't use it. At trial, he tells the judge he used to be a spin class instructor, but since the accident, he can't teach classes anymore. Welp, it turns out he continued to teach these classes after his injury. This was proved by the hours of surveillance the insurance company did, showing him teaching and vigorously riding in spin class. How did the insurance company know he was still an active instructor? The guy posted his full teaching schedule on his Facebook page. His potentially very lucrative claim was quickly changed to a fraud claim against him. Story 11. Not me, but a colleague. A wealthy client's son got picked up for drug dealing at a local music festival. The client bailed him out, and then had his whole fancy law firm defend his son. The son shambled into the courtroom, stoned off his butt, and loudly attempted to buy drugs off the bailiff. There wasn't a lot the lawyers could do after that. Story 12. Client was part of a group of active kid touchers. One of the others murdered the boy while several others were involved with physically abusing him. Our guy's defense was that he was just a voyeur, so although he was there, he wasn't involved in the actual murder. He was on bail the whole time, including the trial, up to when he decided to change his story and say that instead, he hadn't been there. His sister gave evidence that he had come home that night covered in blood, and he got a long, long time. Honestly, good. This was like some divine intervention or something, because this guy deserves to be nowhere on the outside of prison. Like, I'm all for reform, but if whatever criminal activity you're doing is involving children, I think you're a piece of garbage. It's hard to reform that. Story 13. Recently was in court, and apparently part of the requirements of this guy was that he would not talk to his family. He called his mother on Mother's Day. The judge said, "Your mother seems to care about your freedom as little as you do. Put the cuffs on him." Story 14. Not a lawyer, but I was in a courtroom watching injunctions, restraining orders, play out. One case, the woman was there, but the man was in prison, so he was calling in. After deciding on an agreement, the guy asked if he could make a statement. At the end of the statement, he said, "And tell the woman to go screw herself." He got an additional 6 months of prison. The guy asked to make another statement after getting a tongue lashing from the judge, and he did it again, telling her to go screw herself. Another 6 months. Imagine losing a year of your life because you couldn't shut up for 5 minutes. Story 15. I'm not a lawyer, but I used to review disability claims, so I often worked with clients who had lawyers. A man whose attorney had instructed him not to speak with us directly, a very smart, very basic recommendation, called me up, ranting angrily that his lawyer was wrong. He could shop for groceries and mow the lawn and do all sorts of housework just fine, thank you. Now, I had seen this man's medical records. There was no way he was doing all of this without difficulty, so I probed a little further. He could shop for groceries, as long as he used a mobility scooter and had his wife carry things in the house. He could mow the lawn if he used a riding mower and took a lengthy break every 10 minutes or so. He could do housework, which was limited to wiping down counters and folding, but not carrying laundry, and so I called his attorney, gave them a quick update as soon as he and I hung up. I approved his claim, but that man is so damn lucky that he got someone who was willing to take an extra 15 minutes with him. Story 16. Am a criminal defense lawyer. Client arrested on DUI. Client lived in a small town. He and his wife would drive to the one bar in town, drink, then walk to their houseboat after a night at the bar, quarter-mile away. He and wife know everyone in the bar. Another patron they know gets blasted. Bar owner says she can't stay. Client and wife walk her to his car to stay there until the ride comes. Client gets her in the back seat of the SUV. Client is drunk, drops keys on the way to the front seat, opens the now unlocked front door, turns on car lights to see. He walked around the front from rear passenger. Cops are waiting to see if people leave the bar drunk, see the lights, says he saw driving, immediately rolled up and arrests the client. Client has prior DUI from 12-ish years before. Judge agreed that it wouldn't come in. Jury wouldn't hear it unless he opened the door. Can't win the case unless the dude testifies. I prep him, continue to prep him, keep prepping him, but tell him under no circumstances can he say he would never drive drunk, never do anything like that. Basically anything about the past equals no. Direct was going well. Gave him a beautiful, easy last question where he could explain the night, explain why he was upset he got arrested because he wasn't driving and was doing everything right. I would never do something like that. Door open. Judge lets the DA in rebuttal bring in old DUI. Jury took about 25 minutes to convict. And that's about one of 100 stories. Life is never dull in the criminal defense world. Look, I 100% agree. Dude wasn't doing anything wrong. But he was told exactly what to do in court and then didn't do it. So, like, come on, man. You didn't even commit a crime this time. Story 17. Not a lawyer. I was a legal clerk for a couple of years in college. Still baffles me how this one made it all the way to trial. Lady slipped and fell at a chain restaurant and, quote-unquote, hurt her back irreparably. Wanted a huge payout. Said she slipped on butter that was on the floor. On cross-examination, she was asked what type of butter. Her answer? The little pats of butter they put out in the buffet. Defense immediately recalled the store manager, and the store had never used that type of butter. Case ended pretty quickly. Story 18. I'm not a lawyer, this isn't my story. But the lawyer who handled my business stuff and a legal dispute is a federal judge. Before he became a judge, he was a lawyer for divorces and civil stuff. A wealthy male client filed for divorce. There's a prenup. It's pretty ironclad. It discusses the distribution of wealth. The alimony, if any, is laid out at X amount, increasing yearly based on inflation. There's one major exception, and that is, if you are caught cheating, cheating here is defined by any intimate contact with a person before the divorce is final, you automatically get the worst terms of the prenup. In the woman's case, if she cheats, she gets 0 alimony and a one-time payout of $100K. In the man's case, if he cheats, he loses the main family home, all cars that are not his daily driver, and a quarter of his business. A buyout option is available and doesn't matter to the story. Lawyer gets to court and meets with his client in a conference room, and client is beaming. He shakes the lawyer's hand and says, "Hey, Mike, I want you to meet Jasmine. I met her 2 months ago. She's amazing. We got engaged over the weekend in France." And Mike shook her hand and slumped in the chair. He said, "So, we got a major problem. You're cheating on your wife with her. And legally, this is discovery I'm required to hand over to the other side." He's all, "How the hell am I cheating? We're separated." Mike is all, "Ahem. Cheating is any intimate contact before divorce is final. It's in your prenup that you wrote on your own." The guy flipped his crap, ended up being so mad he ditched court, which gave him a default judgment, meaning she got everything she asked for, plus because of the cheating, plus not showing up, the judge ordered that the transfer of money happen within 30 days, as part of the initial agreement between both parties. He's not there to contest it, so blam. The guy ended up trying to sneak the company to the new woman via a trust, but it's an illegal move. He also tried to hide the money with her by giving her $1.1 million in cash, a bank transfer, but the judge stopped that once he found out, and required the woman to repay the money since she was given notice also. He fought for years, and ended up losing money, time, energy, his business, house, 6 to 7 cars, and his new wife. Now, because I know his daughter from work, he's a retired angry man living in rural New Mexico. He can't afford to golf more than once a month, and he posts about how women are scum. Story 19. Not an attorney, but I was in the jury for a 3-defendant murder trial. We sat through weeks of testimony, and from the sheer amount of direct evidence the state had, it was extraordinarily obvious very early on that Defendant 1 had committed the crime. Defendant 2, D1's brother, and Defendant 3, D1's girlfriend, were much less obvious, and we were being asked by the state to consider circumstantial evidence that left most of us feeling like we had to make some leaps to draw conclusions that they wanted us to. That is, until Defendant 3 took the stand. Defendant 3's attorney did a very good job of painting her as the victim of abuse. Her attorney had us feeling sorry for this poor, unintelligent woman who had been groomed since she was 16 by a man 20 years her senior. From the attorney's narrative, D3 was basically D1's slave. He controlled what she wore, what she did, and even who she talked to. He even made her get a tattoo saying D1 name's property. We saw text about D1 murdering D3's puppy because D3 made him mad about something small. We saw texts from D3 to D1 cheering him on after he sent her pictures of a bloody knife, the murder weapon. But D3's attorney had us questioning if those words were just her playing the role of supportive partner, so D1 didn't come after her next. We were starting to believe she was terrified for her own safety, and that's why she didn't report her boyfriend. I mean, clearly, this guy was a maniac, and it seemed reasonable that she just didn't know how to escape him. Then, other defendants' attorneys and the DA tore her apart on cross. They made her look argumentative, tripped her up in multiple lies, and by the time they were done, based on her own testimony, it was pretty clear that she did in fact know the victim, and had been the one to plan the entire murder. Shoot, we even started to feel like she probably manipulated D1 more than he manipulated her. The other defendants did not take the stand. When we went to deliberations, we all discussed how bad of an idea it was for her to testify. We had decided Defendant 1 was guilty on all counts within the first 5 minutes. Defendant 3 was almost as quick. We decided while she did not physically commit the murder, she had conspired and was just as culpable, or whatever the formal charge that was. Defendant 2 took the longest. We all felt pretty strongly that he was involved somehow, but that the DA had not met their burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, so we had to return a not guilty verdict on all counts. Edit for clarification. D1 and D3 were both found guilty on multiple counts, and D1 was found not guilty. Story 20. Used to work at workman's comp firm and, well, hurting themselves again. Oftentimes doing stuff around the house. Falling off a ladder, using tools, going horseback riding, etc. Then they get hurt again and insurance company is off the hook. And many get their doctors to write notes saying they're fine so they can work, because they're bored at home with a huge injury. Then they're baffled they don't get comp anymore. Then they overexert themselves because the injury isn't that better. Story 21. Not a lawyer. My dad's psychotic ex-girlfriend was trying to press bogus charges on my dad, in general trying to ruin his life and career, and his family. She had attempted to make things up about me too. Had to go through interviews, detectives' office talks, APS visits. My dad and I filed protective orders. Her response to the POs, and I was afraid it would happen, was to vandalize a part of his property in a very gross and obscene way. She also went back to the detective to make another claim on me, saying I stole her non-prescribed drugs, so basically admitting she had illegal drugs. So she got a bit more than just protective orders against her. She had jail time now too. Good riddance. Story 22. Had a domestic violence case. For months, we went to preparatory hearings and gathering evidence and got restraining orders. By the time the trial was finally happening on the same morning of the hearing, the person I represented let me know she had gone on holidays with the defendant for a couple of weeks and had a grand old time. At that point, opposing counsel approached me and told me he had lots of evidence of both the parties having a great time together. This, of course, doesn't mean abuse didn't happen in the past, but it really undermined our case, where we had little evidence other than some testimonials. At that point, I had to explain to her how even beyond strict legal rules, the judge would potentially change her mind once she saw the claimant was out partying with the defendant, for whom a restraining order was requested. We settled and avoided the trial. Story 23. Not a lawyer, but my uncle used to be a prison manager at the local prison in the area of NZ where I grew up. They had court hearings when the prisoners had done something against the rules, etc. They would go before a couple of the prison workers and explain, kind of like an internal hearing, I guess. Uncle was a judge for a lot of these. One dude had been found with a cell phone. Denied up and down it was his, didn't know where it came from, blah 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 blah. Uncle asked him several times if he wanted to own up and guy absolutely insisted it wasn't his. Uncle said, "Well, someone wasted $100 on a phone then." Prisoner, "Screw off, I paid $600 for it." Story 24. Client charged with the DUI. Forced by police to give a urine sample on the side of a very busy interstate highway. Any sympathy the jury may have had for the defendant was lost, however, when he fell asleep during the playing of the video of the traffic stop. He had been out all night partying the night before the trial. He was found guilty. Then he lied to the judge about what would be in his system during a drug test, and his sentence was doubled. Story 25. I have two stories that come to mind. One, a colleague of mine was representing an arsonist. This was many years ago. They had allegedly set quite a large fire that burned some public land. Due to the monetary cost of the damage, it was a felony. During the state's case in chief, he began touching himself. Recess had to be called. Funnily enough, that helped him in punishment phase, since there was clearly a mental component there, but still, oof. And I don't know if what had been shown up to that point would have gotten a guilty. Second was one of mine, again many years ago. I had gotten a guy a pretty great deal on a serious theft charge. Prior to it being entered, he ended up picked up by the sheriff's office for violating conditions of bond. Well, how did he violate? The sheriff alleged that he used the banking information of the sheriff's office to pass fake checks. That meant that in this new charge, the sheriff's office was the victim. Needless to say, the deal vanished. Story 26. Not a lawyer, but was raised by one. He did criminal defense for 30 plus years in Texas before taking a position with the DA. Here are some good ones. 1. Capital murder case where I persuaded DA to waive the death penalty. Turns out that the jury acquits on the murder rap, but bags him on aggravated robbery and sentenced him to 45 years. Defendant's family was all mobbed up in the Mexican mafia. They all, mother, grandmother, etc., wore Mickey Mouse shirts. Get it? MM. Mexican mafia. DA was plenty upset about the outcome of that trial. I got the better of him on that one. B. Defendant's name was an interesting case because halfway through the trial, the defendant's brother takes the stand and confesses to the murder. I didn't see that coming. Turns out the defendant and the brother cooked this all up before trial without my knowledge, of course. Anyway, nobody but the defendant's mother believed him. The jury was convicted and the brother was indicted for aggravated perjury. 3. My personal favorite. Client goes on trial for a robbery charge. He shows up for the first day of court. Does not show up for the second day. Judge says, "Well, the show must go on." So my dad has to continue with trial, does the very best he can with an empty table behind him. The jury very clearly pitied him. Client was picked up a few days later in Oklahoma. He had robbed a bank and went to the airport to purchase plane tickets to Hawaii or something. That's where they arrested him. He later told officers that he had planned to steal a boat once he landed. D. But the absolute worst thing a client did to ruin a case? Chose to represent himself on a murder charge. It was horrible. I won't go into detail, but my dad ended up standing in the back of the courtroom per the judge's order. Literally, stand by counsel. Client was absolutely bat-crap insane, but still, it was bad. Jury gave him life. Appellate court overturned and remanded for a new trial. Client wisely opted for representation for entire trial and got 40 years that time. Story 27. She was doing magnet therapy with a quote-unquote therapist 5 hours away by phone. The therapist had the magnets. My client would hold the phone up to various parts of her body that needed the magnetic energy to help it heal. This was all done for $2,000 a month. She never told me about this in the dozens of hours we prepared by talking everything through. I learned during the other side's cross of her. I had never been tempted to head desk in court before. Story 28. My mother was in court as a witness in a case of criminal harassment between two of our neighbors. We basically knew that the case was ridiculous and a sham. The accused neighbor was totally innocent and was being falsely accused by the local troublemakers, who kept on provoking him and who then wanted to be able to sue him for easy money. Anyway, by pure coincidence, the defendant was secular Jewish, just like my parents. Literally just a coincidence. The two troublemaker neighbors who were also there were very angry to see my mother in the court. One of them stood up in the middle of everything and yelled some crap about how my mother is a Jew, and only there because the defendant is a Jew, and Jews apparently always stick together or something. The judge ripped him to shreds and threw the case out. Story 29. Not my client, but defendant posted a Facebook status along the lines of that he had, quote-unquote, taken care of business and the world is a better place for it. He was charged with battery after putting someone in the hospital that had attacked his 14-year-old daughter. The person didn't have a clear memory of the incident, and other testimony later revealed the person beat up had an alibi for the attack in question. Most likely, the girl had made up the story to avoid trouble from being out drinking underage, though we never got the full story. Anyway, the dad was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Story 30. I'm not a lawyer, but the local news ran a clip over and over from a murder trial where the defendant took the stand against their lawyer's advice. The defense was claiming self-defense. As the prosecution read transcripts from damning jail phone calls, the guy on trial, not his lawyer, called for an objection. It threw everyone for a loop. The judge asked him why he called for an objection. Dude was honest and said, I didn't know they'd actually listen to my calls. A recess was granted and dude took a plea deal when court resumed. Story 31. One particular client that comes to mind is a guy who committed a spree of burglaries while on electronic monitoring for another case. The state brought a list of his coordinates to his bond hearing. I actually made the argument that he is clearly not a flight risk since he actually kept his monitor on, and that the court should release him on the same terms as his other case. The judge looked at me like a crazy person and held my client without bond. Story 32. Not a lawyer, but my ex totally screwed his custody case. In a nutshell, the mother took off with the kid and refused to return him. This was in a state where that kind of action would get even supervised visitation taken from her. When she finally sent the child for visitation, the child had visible injuries caused by her boyfriend, and the child told his teachers at school completely unprompted that the boyfriend had hurt him. My ex's parents hired an attorney for him and they got an ex parte order to keep the child. At the first hearing after the ex parte order, both the mother and father were ordered to take drug tests before the next hearing. My ex had a history of drug use. His attorney told him he could get the next hearing pushed back by more than a month so that he would be sure to test clean, and my ex told him not to worry about it. Then, he did some coke and failed the test. Then didn't show up for court and refused to contact his attorney for months, until the attorney had removed himself as the attorney on record. The child was actually at the mother's for visitation when the results came back, so she was able to get an ex parte order to keep him. The reality was he didn't actually want full responsibility for the child, but refused to admit that to his parents, so he deliberately blew the test, and then claimed that since he worked in construction, he must have been exposed to something that caused a failed drug test. I don't know if his parents really believed that, but I was with him for several years before I found out the whole story. He had previously told me he didn't have money for an attorney to fight it, so he just gave her custody, and I left him immediately after finding the truth. It was bad enough that he just didn't want to be a full-time parent, but to do that in a situation when you know your child is being abused, needless to say, it was one of the things that helped me figure out he was a sociopath. I'm surprised it took 32 stories to get one where he intentionally sabotaged it. But also, I was kind of with him before OP mentioned at the end, yeah, the child was abused. I somehow completely forgot that. That definitely makes this dude terrible. Do something for your child. You helped bring them into the world, by the way. Not the best look for any prospective partners either, so OP, glad that he became an ex. Story 33. Legal videographer here. Videotaped a deposition for a man claiming work injuries so severe he couldn't raise his right hand above his shoulder, and his arm was in pain whenever he tried to raise it above the shoulder. Sued his employer claiming it was a work injury. Then came his first deposition. Does anyone know the first thing the court reporter asks of the person testifying? The reporter swears them in by saying, "Would you please raise your right hand and repeat after me?" Then administers the oath to tell the truth. Man who claimed to not be able to raise his right hand above his shoulder raised his hand way above his shoulder. That hand and arm went up like a rocket. Guy didn't even realize what he had done and kept his arm up the whole oath. Neither plaintiff or defense counsel caught it. The court reporter and I just looked at each other and let the depo play out. I was hired by the defense counsel and showed him the first 20 seconds of the video, and took home a nice bonus because of it. Case was dropped shortly after that depo. Story 34. Briefly, he had to testify that doing X thing would not cost him a lot of money. The judge asked him how much money it would cost for him, and he said an amount which was not too much for him because he was rich. But it was a lot compared to what everyone else in the courtroom was making. Other case. The day before the court, I tell him exactly what he is going to answer to certain questions. I specifically tell him to answer X when asked. Time comes, judge asks, and he loses it, like gets a full-on panic attack. He can't speak a single word. He just looks at the judge with a 1,000-yard stare. Disaster. Story 35. I am a lawyer. I was cross-examining a slip and fall plaintiff on the stand in trial after like 2 years of litigation. We were going over some pictures he took when he let slip that the picture of the two signs was missing. I grilled him on what he meant until the judge chastised me for trying to conduct a discovery during trial, which is supposedly not allowed. He had clearly concealed evidence, though. We took a break for the day, and the next day he came back with the photo in question, which showed that he had walked squarely between two wet floor signs to go down the Kroger aisle that he immediately slipped and fell in. He did not recover any money in that one, despite the horrific defense venue. The judge who jumped all over me for exploring obvious evidence tampering was later appointed to the federal bench here in Atlanta. Story 36. Not a lawyer, but I know a cop who went to a report of a guy being mugged.
What did he steal?
275 pounds in cash and about 30 pounds of crack and H.
Really?
Yeah, it was blank. That did it. Known him years, and he's a rival. Cop writes statement detailing what happened and what was stolen.
Sign here if that's all absolutely correct and exactly what happened and was stolen.
The guy signs.
Thanks. You're under arrest for being concerned in the supply of a Class A drug.
The cop prosecuted the caller for possession with intent to supply, and the guy that robbed him for robbery and possession with intent to supply as well. Story 37. One of my brother-in-law lawyers, there were 3 at one point, was described as incompetent and failing to provide adequate counsel by his former client on death row for failing to get an innocent verdict. The problem was that the client, since executed, went to his local bar immediately after committing the murder at the local grocery store in broad daylight, and he proceeded to brag for hours how he had murdered the victim in very specific detail. Also, there were something like more than a dozen eyewitnesses. Story 38. Pro bono VAWA case. Should have been a straightforward petition. Ran an FOIA search on the client before the final submission just in case. Turns out she had been deported from Guam, and then while her immigration ban was still in place, she entered the mainland US without status. When I asked why she had not disclosed this during intake, her response was, "Oh, I thought Guam was its own country and not part of the US, so it didn't matter." Story 39. Client accused of punching another man and knocking a tooth out. He said numerous times on the stand that he had arthritis and was not capable of closing his fist to form the punch as described by the victim. Partway through his cross-examination, the magistrate stopped him to state on the record that he had watched my client clench his fist numerous times. He was found guilty. Story 40. A friend was doing the workman's comp as well as suing the company for a few million. Couldn't bend over, raise his arms, plus everything he could think of. Taking the stand using a cane. Lawyer asks him to read the highlighted parts from the local paper. A week before, he had won a martial arts tournament. He was asked to explain it. The next 15 minutes he explained each kick, punch, etc. with a big smile. I rest my case. Jury foreman asked the judge if they had to leave the room or if they could just announce the verdict. Story 41. Not a lawyer, but I'm a former police officer and spent a lot of time in courtrooms. One guy was on trial for a DUI, and he wanted the judge to know that the cop who arrested him was just some punk kid. He insisted that he'd only had 2 bottles of wine, and his lawyer keeps trying to get him to stop his stream of verbal diarrhea, and he just keeps going. Eventually, the judge says,
I think you should take a moment to confer with your attorney.
and the guy says,
Don't interrupt me. I'm not a child.
Judge smiled and leaned back and said,
By all means, please continue.
Dude's attorney just looked like he was deflating. Story 42. Not my client, but I watched someone admit in open court to solicitation during allocution. This was for statutory assault, which has a mandatory minimum sentence in my state. Judge was already going to give him the minimum, so there was literally nothing he could say that was going to make this go any better than it already was at that moment. But the defendant elected to speak as his attorney died slowly at the table, went into a whole speech about how this charge was unfair, and how it was going to ruin his life and business, pretty usual. But then he went on to say that he usually checks the ages of his escorts, and that this time he didn't, and of course she was underage and now here he is. Judge asked him to repeat it. He said the exact same thing while defense counsel hung his head low. The defendant was a character, had a lot of other eccentric habits and history that I heard about later. The judge was having a pretty good day, so he kept the sentence to the mandatory minimum, and I don't think the prosecutor's office took up the additional charge, but it was still fun to watch someone just absolutely talk themselves into a much worse situation for no reason but ego. Also, the number of people who show up to court for drug cases wearing weed/420 shirts is incredible. I feel like when what's done is done and you're gonna get the minimum sentence, you should just shut your mouth, man. You screwed up, just leave it at that. Don't tell the world how you screwed up more. Story 43. Not a lawyer, but I had jury duty once. Prosecutor.
Defendant, why did you and your friend video record yourselves committing the crime?
Defendant. Well, I got an answer to, there's a good answer, which, organized trafficking carries a sentence of 20 years. Don't do it, and, if you do, don't video it on your phone. Story 44. I was called for jury duty and was sitting in the courtroom watching the other potential jurors get questioned by the attorneys, just waiting for my possible turn to be questioned. One of the charges was aggravated assault. The defense asked one juror, who was a professional videographer, if her career made her more or less likely to put stock in video footage. To me, this was a hint but not admission that video footage would be a big part of the case. Before the juror could even answer, the defendant yelled from his table,
I had a mask on! You can't even see my face!
The entire room went silent for about 5 seconds before the defense attorney regained his composure and asked the judge to dismiss the jury pool. The judge dismissed us back to the holding room. 5 minutes later, one of the clerks of the court came in and told us, even the already selected jurors, that the trial was being rescheduled and we were all dismissed. Story 45. Not a lawyer, but I was in a jury, and on the first day of trial after jury selection during a lunch break, a random friend of the defendant came up to us saying all sorts of nonsense about how defendant was framed and had to look up specific statuses citing the law. This was for a serious drug trafficking and violence case. We all reported what happened to the bailiff so we could be properly thrown off the jury. He said just sit tight and it probably won't matter. The case was settled by the time we came back to court, and the judge threw out the settlement offer saying he, the judge, didn't appreciate the defendant wasting everyone's time. Wild stuff. Story 46. I was at court once fighting a traffic ticket, and a guy's lawyer was pleading no contest to a charge he got for having a firearm on probation. It sounded like he was getting more probation and it would be done with that. Then the judge says,
Do you have anything to say before we move forward?
And the guy says,
I didn't know having a gun was against the rules, and I had a gun, so I guess that makes me guilty.
Smiled like he just stuck it to the man. The look on the lawyer and judge's faces were of so much disappointment. So being in a courtroom and saying, I guess that makes me guilty, probably not the best move. I'll have to store that one away for later. Story 47. Not an attorney, but I had a woman I arrested ask for a probable cause hearing. The charge was for escape. She had cut off her GPS anklet and ran, and PC hearings for these sorts of things were very uncommon. Normally, only new public defenders used them, outside of a couple of other defense strategies for more serious offenses. Point being, there wasn't a whole lot of reason for having the hearing. She cut the anklet off, and we had evidence of that due to the anklet having been recovered. Anyway, not only did she want the PC hearing, she demanded to testify. Her public defender, a newish one at the time, strongly recommended against it. He went and got another PD who had a good rapport with this woman. Obviously, she was very familiar with our criminal court, who again recommended that she not testify. Nope, our girl wanted her time on the stand. So the hearing goes forward. Before it started, even the judge strongly recommends the defendant not go through with the hearing. Well, she did. Her testimony was that she'd been taken against her will by her boyfriend, and that he made her cut off the anklet. I was called up as a witness, provided screenshots of the defendant's Facebook account, where she was shown with her boyfriend, smiling happily, enjoying time with him and her daughter, etc. All date/time-stamped, of course. Obviously, probable cause was found by the judge that a crime had been committed and the case was sent to the grand jury for indictment. But actually having a judge tell the defendant that testifying was a bad idea was a first for me. What goes through your mind where you're like, yeah, I know better than the judge here. I've got this. There's no way they would have thought of my solid defense. Story 48. My lawyer husband had a case where he basically fired the client. It was a civil case and the guy was in the right. All he had to do was turn up and testify and he was a no-show. Turned out the idiot got drunk, had a fight with his daughter-in-law, slugged her, and she had him thrown in jail. No one wanted to bail the guy out. My husband said he didn't want to represent someone who would do that, and sent him to another law firm. Story 49. A foreign client had very limited command of the local language. We tried to prove that the client acted in good faith and was very cooperative, and also asked the client not to directly contact the respondent. However, the client was very happy to write multiple letters to the respondent in a very broken local language in which, among others, called the attorney of a respondent a cunning little harlot, and the respondent was happy to submit it to the court. Story 50. Not a lawyer, but used to investigate RTAs and similar claims. The amount of passengers who couldn't provide the most basic details of the RTAs they were supposedly involved in was a phenomenal thing to behold. I recall one incident where, ostensibly, there were 4 passengers in the car: brothers, sister, and mother. The brothers, driver and front seat passenger, were able to recall the key details, but the mother and sister couldn't offer any compelling evidence that they were in the car. They couldn't remember where they sat, or what time of day it was, or what the weather was, or where they were coming from or going to, where the impact came from, what the other vehicle looked like, what happened afterwards, whether the emergency services attended. We always tried to be sympathetic to the fallibility of memory, but there's a limit. Unrelated advice: if you are ever planning to fake a claim, maybe have a sit down with all the participants and agree the key details in advance, just the basics at least. Story 51. Not a lawyer. Mac Wayne, the blind from shooting himself in the head drug dealer and pimp that turned up to court fully blinged out, fur coat and whatnot. The icing on the cake is he would walk in with a lady on each arm that he employed as his seeing eye female dogs. All told, the search warrants executed in this case resulted in the seizure of approximately 93 pounds of methamphetamine, 15 pounds of H, 35,000 suspected fent pills, 24 firearms, approximately $525,000, and a bank account valued at $100,000. Seizures made prior to December 16, 2020 included more than 154 pounds of methamphetamine, 20 pounds of H, and more than 7,000 suspected fent pills. Agents were able to identify Frisbee as the person on the phone by comparing his voice to the Amazon Prime documentary, Blind and Battered, The Blind Kingpin. The documentary chronicles Frisbee's life, and in it, he freely discusses his work as a drug dealer and pimp. The documentary is a good watch. It's absolutely crazy, but an insightful view into a guy that had no chance in life. But it's hard not to like him. The reason he shot himself in the head is because someone owed him money. He pulls out his gun and asks the guy, "You trying to jack me, Jack?" and then shoots himself in the head. Wild times. Story 52. I'm a lawyer and I could write a book about this. Most dumb things happen when I'm out of office or in trial and can't correct their behavior. Most common, lying about easily verifiable, small things on the stand. Ruins credibility completely. We know you don't pick your child up every single time from daycare. The daycare has a log, and your mom signed the kid out 50% of the time. We know you filed multiple restraining orders on your spouse because it is electronic public record. Second most common, changing their story on the stand. I'm prepared for facts to be the way you told me. I can't prepare for something I don't know about. Third most common, completely ignoring advice. I told you that you couldn't take that $150,000 out of the bank account without repercussions. Incoming contempt. Order to sell the marital home. Home is actively for sale with a realtor. Client puts padlock on house so no one can access or sell it. Here comes contempt. After 5 years, I finally got a client custody of the kids. When the client went to pick up the kids, the client brought a known violent felon, a loaded gun, and got in a physical fight with the guardian of the child. Emergency petition filed, children removed from her care, had them for less than a week. Had the audacity to call me a bad attorney in front of the judge because the kids were removed. Judge laughed and informed the client I had won the case for her until her own actions caused this reversal, allowed me to withdraw on the spot. You know, the lawyer is getting blamed for absolutely everything. It resonates with me as someone who plays online games. This client telling their lawyer that it was the lawyer's fault that they got reversed sounds really similar to me playing League of Legends for some reason. Story 53. I was a 3L student in school's family law clinic. We had one of those custody cases that would just not die. The husband remarried, and stepmom did not want biomom to exist in their happy family, and dragged this mom to court for the smallest things to try and get full custody instead of 50-50 of her spirit son. We were in court every other month just for this case. The court never budged on custody. Eventually, stepmom decided us meddling kids were the only thing keeping her from her spirit son. Stepmom called the law school and made a complaint against my team, accusing us of doing really horrible stuff to the child and threatening them. They then demanded we be expelled or the university would be sued. We filed an emergency hearing and told the judge everything, and asked for sanctions and argued harassment. Judge found the couple in contempt for threatening us to sway the case. The judge then said he questioned their ability to effectively co-parent and act in the child's best interests. Mom was given primary custody, and they got every other weekend and some holidays. The judge also decided that given the couple's history, they were harassing the mom using the court and banned them from further custody filings. Later, we found out the couple also filed a bar complaint against our professor, too. That was investigated and found without merit. Story 54. Not a lawyer, but an acquaintance decided I was to be his new girlfriend and was going to move in with me. I got home from an evening at a Buddhist temple where we were all meditating on, I shall surely die tonight. Shane, an athlete with karate achievements, had shoved his way in while I was out, and greeted me with a punch in the head to put me in my place. Luckily for me, he'd got tired while waiting for me, so instead of murdering me for resisting, he fell asleep while holding me down on the carpet. My face unrecognizable by then, but my head only broken in 3 places. I called the police and he was still asleep when they arrived. The 4 of them scared to come in after seeing what he'd done to me. Reassured they'd be able to handcuff him before he woke, they carefully entered, read him his rights once he woke. He showed them his bleeding, bone-bared knuckles and yelled, "Arrest her! Look what she did to my hands!" They apologetically explained they would have to take me in too, then asked him how I'd done that. "It was her head. Her head was too hard." In court, his legal rep spun a tale that Shane had been stealing my TV. I was terribly strong, got angry and bashed him up, and he was defending himself. A policeman on cross asked Shane how he would rate my fighting ability. He laughed, scoffing, "Her fight? She's so weak, she couldn't hurt a fly." He got 6 months in jail. However, he'd bashed up 3 police when they first took him in. They weren't very forgiving. Every time he was released, they met him at the gate, goaded him into throwing more punches, and he'd be straight back inside. He'd promised me if I got the police, he would murder me and my children. That was in '88. He's still in jail, and we're safe. Story 55. Not a lawyer, but one of my coworkers. I work in manufacturing and had a coworker drop a very, very big piece of steel on his foot. Like, we're talking his foot popped like a water balloon, and they found blood splatter on the wall 15 feet away. This was a privately owned company, and without being prompted, the owner offered the guy a retirement package where he would get paid his full salary, plus 5% annual raise, plus the cost of marketplace health insurance until retirement age, roughly 15 years. Instead of being grateful, the employee turned down the retirement package and sued for an undisclosed sum. His claim was that the company didn't offer proper lifting straps, and the straps he had were worn and faulty. When the defense was making their case, they simply presented the OSHA filing. The company A had proper lifting straps installed at the workstation, B had spare replacement straps on hand, and C, the employee signed off on his own straps that morning. The defense was able to prove that the company had followed all OSHA requirements, and the accident happened because of negligence on the part of the employee. He lost the case, and ended up with nothing but a missing foot for his trouble. He tried crawling back to the owner to see if the retirement package was still on offer and was kicked out of the building. Story 56. One of the first and only divorce cases I took as a solo was a man who said his wife had run away back to Nepal and abandoned him and their 7-year-old daughter in the States. He said he had no way to get in touch with her or find her, and that she was likely with a new lover. So we effect service by publication, file everything at court, and cases rolling along uncontested. Until the wife shows up. She gets her own lawyer and shows that her husband knew where she was the whole time. He admits to me via email that he may have been a bit deceptive with me. I told him that if he was willing to be fully truthful with me going forward, we could work with wife's attorney to come to an agreement, but he would need to pay me more now because it's a messy contested divorce, and his small retainer for uncontested is depleted. He did not do either of those things. I had zero faith he would not continue to lie. He gave me more reasons to see that he was continuing to lie to me, so after telling him I couldn't represent him anymore, I filed for withdrawal of representation, a mandatory one based on fraud to the court. Show up to court for the motion hearing and he stands up and says he objects and doesn't want me to withdraw. Said I'm only trying to walk because of the money, and then tries to hand over every communication we've had to the court. He printed all of our emails. Wife's lawyer looks at me and, as client is trying to hand these over, informs him that they would get to see everything as well, so maybe that's not a great idea. Wife's lawyer was really great. Judge is dumbfounded. I tell him it's a mandatory withdrawal, and if I give any additional info, I'm prejudicing my soon-to-be ex-client. Judge briefly tries to explain to client what that meant and allowed my motion. He shut up and I walked out. Story 57. Not a lawyer but a forensic professional, and this wasn't dumb. The poor client couldn't help himself. Like Ron White said, he had the right to remain silent, but not the ability. Involuntary commitment hearing of a very manic and psychotic man who was hospitalized after trying to break into his mom's house by pounding on the door with his .357 Magnum. After going into diagnosis and mental illness, etc. at length, the prosecutor rested his case having literally forgot to ask the doctor if this man met criteria to be committed. The defense attorney, with a surprised smile, was about to ask the judge to dismiss the case. Basically, he had won, and his client hauled on his sleeve and they had a heated whispered conversation. The attorney informed the judge his client was demanding to testify against his advice. After cautioning him that his testimony was not required, the poor man took the stand and launched into a rambling, angry rant about a myriad of disconnected, delusional thoughts until stopped by the judge. His last sentence was, "Oh, and Your Honor, make them give me my gun back." He was committed. Yeah, I agree with OP on this one. That's not dumb, that's just kind of sad. This man clearly is not all there mentally and needs some form of help. Unfortunately, being committed isn't always or even often the best way to get that. Still, just unfortunate. Story 58. I'm not a lawyer, but had a case against a totally insane neighbor who built a fence on my property. He had a court order to move it and only moved it about 3 inches. It was supposed to move about 6 feet. Up on the stand, judge said, "You will move the fence to the correct place within 7 days, or we'll find you in contempt of court. The rest of the charges will depend on your cooperation." He was up for a few other things as well. He said under his breath, "I'm not moving that fence again." You should have seen the judge's head snap up. "What was that?" "Nothing." He was found in contempt that day, had to pay a fine, and was doing weekend jail for a month. He also lost all the other cases. Story 59. Client pleading guilty to a fairly minor domestic violence case with a deal to be getting a sentence with no jail time and no criminal record. Judge asks him if he has anything to say. We discussed this many times and I told him, say nothing. He doesn't have to say anything, it's just an opportunity. He gets up and says, "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but sometimes that female dog just has it coming." I watched the judge pick up the piece of paper where she'd written down the planned sentence, set it aside, and start an entirely new page of notes. Anyway, he got some non-trivial jail time. You know what? Good. I'm glad this piece of garbage said something else. He deserves whatever the judge gave him. Probably a little more. I don't know what OP classifies as fairly minor domestic violence, but to ever say they have it coming when, in court? You're just a moron. Story 60. My grandfather had a good friend that was a superior court judge back in the 60s and 70s. There was an outlaw motorcycle club that was causing a lot of problems and selling drugs in the area. Eventually, their leader showed up in his court. Judge sentenced him to pay a huge maximum fine for some minor offense just as a way of trying to get them out. The leader of the motorcycle club looked over at the cops and started laughing out loud, while he took a huge roll of bills out of his pocket and counted the amount of the fine. Judge said, "I'll tell you what, pal. Why don't you just put that money back, reach into your other pocket, and pull out 6 months? Biker stopped laughing. Story 61. My client and I were in a meeting to have her kid returned to her from foster care. They were talking about how she needs to be careful about who she dates, because there was some domestic violence against her involved in the case. She tells them she isn't going to date anyone. They said that's unrealistic because she's young, etc. Then she says she isn't dating because she's back with her ex, who abused her. Walked into the meeting thinking about talking about schedules, left with them planning to terminate her parental rights. Story 62. Not a lawyer, but my crazy ex lectured the judge on custody law during her hearing after she kidnapped our daughter and her sister. She had her notes written on pages torn out of books from the jail's library. To say the judge wasn't amused was an understatement. The judge stood up, leaned over her desk, told my ex-wife to sit down and shut up, and that she had 20 years of experience with custody law and she would not be lectured to by her. My own lawyer's eyes went wide. He shot me a glance that clearly said, "Don't smile or say a word." While this was happening, he was struggling not to laugh. Story 63. Guy gets sued as a co-signer on a car note. Buyer was guy's kid. Guy swears up and down that he didn't sign the note, has a wildly different signature than what's on the note, backed up by government-issued documents reflecting this wildly different signature. Comes to trial. Judge turns to this guy and asks, "Do you ever sign your name that way?" Guy sheepishly responds, "Yes, sometimes." Judge enters judgment against him pretty quick. Story 64. Not going to badmouth my former clients, even the ones who might deserve it. But my opposing counsel's client, we were suing a debt collector for freezing my client's bank account without first obtaining a judgment against her. Big no-no here in New York. This guy's been in the industry since before I was born, so I know it was not an accident, and suspected that there was some reason he couldn't sue, and that was why he did it. But I thought there was no way we would be able to prove that, and that we would settle out relatively cheap because there was no way we could prove it was anything more than negligence. This doofus produces the records for the underlying debt. One of them looks very clearly digitally altered, so I subpoena the creditor. Sure enough, he had changed the date of default to try to hide that the debt was time-barred, as in, he couldn't file a lawsuit about it. That certainly would not have been good for him, but he still could have argued it wasn't enough to prove intent. However, nothing quite infers intent like trying to do a cover-up, and his poor attorney did not check discovery carefully enough and totally missed it. He had to withdraw from the case because he just accidentally suborned perjury. Was great for me and my client. If you do something bad and get caught, trying to lie and cover it up will often get you in way more trouble. Story 65. I started at a new law firm that was in the middle of a long false advertising litigation. Our client, defendant, maintained that their advertising claims were supported by scientific reports written years before that no one could find now. The scientist who'd run the tests said he remembered doing them but could not remember the results. The case progresses to trial, and at the close of plaintiff's evidence, my client's CFO bursts into the federal courtroom holding, I crap you not, a copy of the report. He had found it in the back of some cabinet he was cleaning out for God knows what reason. Pandemonium. Plaintiff calls for mistrial. Judge is banging his gavel. Parties are yelling at each other across the aisle. My boss is objecting into thin air, and no one is listening to anyone. The report supported literally nothing in the advertising. Great evidence for plaintiff's case. Confirmed everything they claimed in the complaint. We got dragged for like $10 million in losses. I left the firm shortly after, in part because I was convinced that my boss and the CEO had burned what they thought was every last copy, and I still think the CFO kept one and did this on purpose because of beef with the CEO. Story 66. The quote-unquote sympathetic witness with which I attempted to lead randomly decided to announce to the court and audience that she owns 6 homes and used to work for Lockheed Martin, which was not nearly as endearing as the stories she told me during prep sessions. No one liked that. The judge had fun ruling against us wherever she could. Story 67. Not a lawyer, but was on the jury. Defendant is on trial for murder and aggravated assault. During an elderly witness's testimony, she described where she was standing in the house, while the defendant pulled up to the house and then confronted her grandson, victim. She stated she was standing at the living room window at first. He blurted out, "Hey, you were at the door, not the window." His lawyers didn't even request that stricken. People really have this weird belief that if they catch anyone with anything wrong that they can win the case. No, if it doesn't help your case, don't say it, please. That said, this guy was on trial for murder and aggravated assault, so, well, probably deserved. Story 68. Not a lawyer. Government agency brought an application for a permanent restraining order against a woman who had been abusing my elderly dad. She represented herself and I had to testify. The prospect of being crossed by someone so psychologically abusive with my dad's safety at stake just terrified me. But luckily, she thought she was God's gift to Perry Mason. She favored the dramatic, "would it surprise you to learn" format, so all I had to do most of the time was say yes with a straight face and explain why. Her first question was, "Would it surprise you to learn that drug dealers stole your dad's stuff?" 6 months previously, she had told me my brother was keeping it safe. Then she argued with my answer in a way that got the judge really locked on the issue. That led to her being an hour late returning from lunch. She clumped in finally with this huge Rubbermaid tote full of his things. She didn't win. My dad was never bothered by her or her daughter again. In fact, she put on such display of her own malevolence that the judge extended the protection to all of his family members as well. Story 69. Not a lawyer, but I sued a company that installed an AC unit in my house. They installed it backwards, which caused the damage. They refused to come look at it, and I had to get another company to fix it. I took them into small claims and brought out all the documents. They didn't bring anything except a text message I sent about it being fixed. This was after the other company fixed it, but they tried to use that message to say it was fixed. Judge pointed out the date of the message and the date of the invoice from the other company. A guy also tried to say that they weren't responsible because his stepson did the work. Judge got out of them that his stepson was indeed working for the company at the time. Needless to say, I won. The guy even had the nerve to ask for the unit and I said no. Sold it for parts. Story 70. Not the lawyer, but we're sitting in a settlement conference where we present our alleged violations, and the respondent attempts to prove us wrong. More complicated than that, but you get the idea. Anyway, our lawyer reads the first item on the list, and their lawyer starts arguing that they definitely don't do that and never have, saying, "How dare we even suggest such an upstanding and compliant business would do such a thing, blah blah." Our lawyer calmly opens a folder and slides a couple of photos across the table, tells them I took the photos during an inspection on whatever date, and if you look at them you'll see what we're talking about is clearly shown. The lawyer stops talking and looks at his client, who says, "I didn't realize they had photos," while looking down at the table. The conversation immediately switches to trying to negotiate the penalty lower. Story 71. Not mine, colleague's client. He was arrested for DUI, demanded that the attorney should, quote, "get the video. That'll prove I was wrongly arrested." Attorney dutifully requests the dashcam footage. When he reviews it in his office, laughter ensues. Client arrives to view it. Appropriate stop. Asked to get out for FST. Tries 2 to 3 times to complete walk and turn. Looks at the cop and says, "Ain't fair. This is hard for drunk people." They took the plea offer. And what did you think saying that would do for you there, buddy? You're in a field sobriety test, and you're just like, this is hard for drunk people. That's the point, you... Anyway, story 72. I'm immediately reminded about this case which was discussed here a few years ago. In short, a body is found, then identified. Later the same week, a guy called his ex-drug dealer, who was in jail, to ask him for drugs. When the dealer says he can't because he is, once again, in jail, and that he should stop calling him for that, the guy tries to play hard by saying he's just committed a murder, also naming a friend who helped him. Of course, he and the friends are arrested. Turns out at the time of the murder, he had his arm broken and in a plaster, so he physically couldn't have murdered anyone. But for his stupidity, he was kept in prison. So the police keep pressuring the friend. The two never stop to betray each other. Turned out they didn't know anything about the murder. The friend also couldn't have physically committed the crime. He was seen by the police at another place at the moment of the event. They both have served almost a year for a crime none of them committed. Getting jail time for something that you didn't commit and the court knows you didn't commit just because you were stupid is crazy. What do you mean you called someone who's in jail to ask for drugs and then say you murdered someone? This is, oh my god. These defendants aren't defending anything. These poor lawyers. Anyway, that's the last story we have for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.